Hey there. Welcome to Lost in Fear. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So, before you get too cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Story 1. The Alaska wilderness has a way of making people disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically. Sometimes it happens quietly, methodically, as if the land itself is slowly erasing someone from existence. Thomas Marcos Seibold learned this truth in the summer of 1987, though he would never live to tell anyone about it. Thomas was 29 years old when he arrived in Fairbanks that June. He had driven up from Oregon in his beat-up Ford pickup, the bed loaded with camping gear, photography equipment, and enough supplies to last him 3 months in the backcountry. He was a nature photographer by trade, though not a particularly successful one. His work had appeared in a few regional magazines, nothing major, but Thomas didn't care about fame or fortune. He cared about the wilderness. He cared about capturing moments that most people would never see. His plan was simple. He would spend the summer documenting the wildlife and landscapes around the Tanana River Valley, a vast and largely unpopulated region east of Fairbanks. He had permits, maps, and a satellite phone that his mother had insisted he'd bring. Thomas had rolled his eyes at the phone, but he'd packed it anyway, along with extra batteries and a solar charger. He wasn't reckless. He was experienced. He'd spent summers in the Cascades, the Olympics, even a season in the Brooks Range. He knew how to read topographic maps, how to purify water, how to avoid bears. He knew the rules of survival. What Thomas didn't know was that someone else was watching him. Someone who had been watching hikers and photographers and wandering souls for years. Someone who understood the Alaska wilderness better than any guidebook ever could. Pastor Leonard Wickham had been serving the small community of Delta Junction for 11 years when Thomas Seibold drove through town on June 15. Delta Junction was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the gas station doubled as the grocery store, and where Sunday services at the Wilderness Gospel Chapel was still the social event of the week. Pastor Wickham was beloved by his congregation. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver hair and gentle blue eyes that seemed to radiate compassion. He volunteered with search and rescue. He counseled troubled youth. He visited the sick and the elderly. His wife, Margaret, was the mayor's sister, a detail that gave the pastor a certain unofficial authority in town affairs. But Leonard Wickham had a secret, a dark, twisted ideology that he'd been nurturing for decades. He believed that the wilderness was sacred, that it needed to be fed, that certain people were chosen to return to the earth in the purest way possible. He believed that he was the instrument of this divine ecology, and he believed that no one would ever catch him because the wilderness covered his tracks better than any alibi ever could. Thomas stopped at the chapel on his second day in Delta Junction. He wasn't particularly religious, but he'd learned over the years that small-town churches were excellent sources of local information. Pastors and priests always knew the best trails, the most dangerous areas, the places where cell service dropped to nothing. Thomas wanted to ask about access roads to the Tanana River Valley. Pastor Wickham greeted him warmly in the parking lot, shaking his hand with both of his own. They talked for 20 minutes in the shade of a birch tree. Thomas explained his project. The pastor listened intently, nodding, asking thoughtful questions. He recommended a few spots. an old mining road that led to a network of game trails. A ridge overlooking the river where the light was spectacular at sunset. An abandoned cabin that Thomas could use as a base camp if he didn't mind sharing it with the mice. "You'll be careful out there," the pastor said. It wasn't a question. His eyes held Thomas's gaze just a moment too long. "Always am," Thomas replied. "Good. The wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes." Thomas thanked him and drove away. He didn't notice the pastor watching his truck disappear down the highway. He didn't see the pastor write down his license plate number in a small leather notebook that he kept in his jacket pocket. 3 days later, Thomas set up camp near the abandoned cabin the pastor had mentioned. It was perfect, isolated, quiet. The cabin itself was in rough shape, missing half its roof and most of one wall, but the structure was stable enough to store his gear. He pitched his tent 50 yards away, near a creek that would provide fresh water. For the first week, everything went according to plan. He photographed moose at dawn, eagles at midday, and the endless summer twilight that turned the Tanana Valley into something otherworldly. He called his mother on the satellite phone every 3 days, just to let her know he was alive. On June 29th, Thomas hiked 8 miles west to photograph a series of beaver dams he'd spotted from a ridge. He returned to camp just before midnight, exhausted but exhilarated. The light had been perfect. He'd shot 6 rolls of film. He heated a can of soup on his camp stove, ate standing up, and crawled into his sleeping bag, without even brushing his teeth. He didn't hear the footsteps approaching his tent at 2 in the morning. He didn't hear the whisper of fabric as someone crouched beside the mesh door. He woke only when the blade of a hunting knife sliced through the nylon and a gloved hand, clamped over his mouth. Pastor Wickham looked different in the darkness. His gentle eyes were cold now, almost reptilian. He pressed the knife against Thomas's throat hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Don't make a sound," the pastor whispered. "The wilderness needs you." Thomas tried to scream, tried to fight, but the pastor was stronger than he looked. Years of hauling firewood and butchering game had built a wiry, deceptive strength in his frame. He zip-tied Thomas's wrists behind his back, then his ankles. He stuffed a rag in his mouth and secured it with duct tape. The entire process took less than 90 seconds. The pastor dragged Thomas out of the tent and into the trees. He moved with practiced efficiency, following a route he'd scouted weeks earlier. A half-mile from the campsite, he'd prepared a location. A shallow depression in the earth, lined with rocks, hidden beneath a fallen spruce. It wasn't a grave, not yet. It was a waiting place. He left Thomas there, bound and gagged, while he returned to the campsite. He worked methodically, carefully. He packed Thomas's tent, his camping gear, his photography equipment. He loaded everything into Thomas's pickup truck, which was parked on an access road a mile south. Then he drove the truck 60 miles east to a remote trailhead near the Canadian border. He wiped down the interior, pocketed the keys, and walked away. A member of his congregation, a man who owed the pastor several favors, picked him up an hour later in a different vehicle. They drove back to Delta Junction in silence. Thomas spent 3 days in the depression beneath the fallen spruce. The pastor visited him twice each day, bringing water but no food. He wanted Thomas weak but conscious. He would sit on a log nearby and talk about theology, about the cycle of life and death, about the sacred duty of returning flesh to the earth. Thomas couldn't respond through the gag, could only stare with terrified, pleading eyes. On the 3rd day, the pastor brought a shovel. "It's time," he said gently. The wilderness has accepted you. What happened next was mercifully quick. The pastor was many things, but he wasn't a sadist. He believed his work was holy, a necessary function of the natural order. He killed Thomas with a single blow to the back of the head, then spent the next several hours burying him deep in the soft earth. He scattered the rocks over the grave, arranged fallen branches to match the surrounding forest floor, and planted a small spruce sapling at the head of the site. Within a year, the forest would reclaim the spot entirely. Thomas's mother reported him missing on July 6th, when he failed to make his scheduled call. The Alaska State Troopers opened an investigation. They found his truck at the trailhead near the Canadian border, but no sign of Thomas himself. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks. They found nothing. Eventually, the search was scaled back, then suspended. Thomas Seibold became another name on the long list of people who had walked into the Alaska wilderness and never walked out. Pastor Wickham attended the memorial service that Thomas's family held in Oregon that fall. He drove all the way down from Alaska, arriving with flowers and condolences. He told Thomas's mother that her son had stopped by the church, that he'd seemed happy and excited about his project. He prayed with the family. He hugged them. Nobody suspected him, because nobody could imagine that a man of God, a respected pillar of the community, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Nobody knew that Thomas was the fourth person Pastor Wickham had killed in the Alaska backcountry over the past decade. Nobody knew that he kept a leather notebook in his desk at home, filled with names, dates, and locations. Nobody knew that he'd already selected his next target, a solo kayaker who'd been asking around town about rivers in the region. The wilderness kept its secrets, and Pastor Leonard Wickham kept killing. But secrets, even ones buried deep in the Alaskan earth, have a way of surfacing. In 2003, 16 years after Thomas Seibold's disappearance, a wildfire swept through the Tanana River Valley. The blaze burned for weeks, consuming thousands of acres of forest. When the smoke finally cleared and investigators began assessing the damage, a forestry crew stumbled upon something unusual near an old burned-out spruce tree. Human remains, partially exposed by the fire, unmistakably human. The Alaska State Troopers returned to the site with forensic specialists and cadaver dogs. Over the next month, they found 3 more graves within a 5-mile radius, all of them hidden with the same meticulous care, all of them in locations that would have remained undiscovered if not for the fire. The remains were badly degraded, but dental records eventually provided identifications. Thomas Marco Seibold, a hiker from Washington named Claire Devereaux, who'd vanished in 1991, a wildlife biologist from Montana named Robert Cheng, who'd disappeared in 1995, and a young woman from California named Amy Sutton, who'd gone missing in 1999. The investigation exploded. A task force was formed, drawing resources from state police, the FBI, and the National Park Service. Detectives began reviewing decades of missing persons cases across Alaska, looking for patterns. They found them. Dozens of unsolved disappearances. Solo hikers, photographers, scientists, all of them last seen in small towns along the interior highway system. All of them experienced outdoors people who should have known better than to simply vanish. The task force began interviewing residents of Delta, Junction, and surrounding communities. They asked about the victims. They asked about anyone who might have had contact with multiple missing persons over the years. And slowly, carefully, a name began to emerge: Pastor Leonard Wickham. He'd been the one to suggest hiking locations to Claire Devereaux. He'd provided maps to Robert Cheng. He'd counseled Amy Sutton when she'd been feeling anxious about her solo trip. He'd attended search operations for all of them, offering prayers and support to the families. In October 2003, investigators executed a search warrant on Pastor Wickham's home. They found the leather notebook in his desk drawer. They found newspaper clippings about missing persons. They found topographic maps with locations marked in red ink. And in his basement, they found a locked cabinet containing items that had belonged to the victims: Thomas Seibold's camera, Claire Devereaux's watch, Robert Cheng's field journal, Amy Sutton's necklace, trophies. Pastor Leonard Wickham was arrested on October 14, 2003. He confessed to all 4 murders within hours of his arrest. He showed no remorse. He explained his ideology calmly, rationally, as if he were delivering a sermon. The wilderness needed to be fed. He was simply fulfilling a sacred duty. The victims had been chosen. It was their destiny to return to the earth. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. Pastor Wickham was too organized, too methodical, too aware of the consequences of his actions. On March 11, 2004, he was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. But the case didn't end there, because Pastor Wickham's confession only accounted for 4 victims. His notebook contained 17 names, 17 people who had disappeared in the Alaska backcountry over a 20-year period. 13 of them were still unaccounted for, and when investigators pressed him about the others, the pastor simply smiled. "The wilderness keeps its secrets," he said. The task force continued its work. Additional search teams returned to the Tanana River Valley and surrounding areas. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and forensic archaeologists. Over the next 3 years, they found 6 more graves, but 7 victims remained missing. 7 people whose families would never have closure. 7 graves that the wilderness refused to reveal. And there was another disturbing development. In 2006, investigators discovered evidence suggesting that Pastor Wickham hadn't acted entirely alone. Financial records showed regular payments to several individuals in Delta Junction and surrounding communities. Payments that coincided with the dates of several disappearances. Phone records revealed calls between the pastor and a deputy sheriff, a local pilot, and a hunting guide. The nature of these communications remained unclear, but the implication was chilling. Had there been others? A network of accomplices who helped Pastor Wickham identify targets, dispose of evidence, cover his tracks. The investigation expanded once again. A joint task force involving state and federal agencies began looking into the connections. They interviewed dozens of people. They executed additional search warrants. They followed paper trails and digital breadcrumbs. And slowly, they began to uncover evidence of something larger, something more organized, something that suggested Pastor Leonard Wickham had been part of a broader network of individuals who shared his twisted ideology. The case remains open. The task force continues its work, now operating under the codename Operation Tanana. New evidence arrives periodically. Anonymous tips, deathbed confessions, hikers discovering unusual markings on trees in remote areas. Each lead is investigated thoroughly. Each possibility is explored. As of today, 3 additional suspects have been identified, though none have been formally charged. The investigation spans multiple states and involves coordination with Canadian authorities, because the evidence suggests that the network's activities weren't limited to Alaska. There are suspicious disappearances in British Columbia, in the Yukon, in Montana and Washington and Idaho, remote areas where the wilderness is vast and unforgiving, places where bodies could remain hidden forever. Thomas Marco Seibold's family finally got closure, but their relief was tempered by the knowledge that so many others were still waiting, still hoping, still wondering what happened to their loved ones, who walked into the wilderness and never came home. The Alaska wilderness is beautiful. It's also merciless. It can hide evidence, erase footprints, swallow secrets, but it can't hide everything forever. Fires reveal what they shouldn't. Animals disturb what should remain buried. Hikers stumble upon things they were never meant to find. The investigation continues. The wilderness is slowly giving up its dead, and somewhere in a maximum security prison, Pastor Leonard Wickham sits in his cell, reading his Bible, maintaining his silence, protecting the secrets that he swore he would take to his grave. But graves, even ones hidden deep in the Alaskan backcountry, don't stay hidden forever. The earth shifts, the seasons change, and the truth, buried though it may be, has a way of rising to the surface. One body at a time, one name at a time, one family at a time. Thomas Marco Seibold wanted to capture the beauty of the Alaska wilderness. Instead, he became part of its darkest secrets. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it wears a collar and carries a Bible. Sometimes it has gentle eyes and a warm handshake. Sometimes it's the last person anyone would ever suspect. And sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in the wilderness. Sometimes they're the ones offering to show you the way in Story 2, Asterisk. Carl Mickham believed he was prepared for anything when the bush plane dropped him off at a remote lake 80 miles northeast of Fairbanks on March 24, 1981. He was 35 years old, a photographer and outdoor enthusiast who had spent the previous year planning what he called his wilderness sabbatical. He wanted to spend the summer photographing wildlife in their natural habitat, away from roads, away from people, away from everything that defined modern civilization. He wanted authenticity, solitude, a chance to test himself against the raw elements of the Alaskan interior. The pilot who flew him in, a bush veteran named Jim Olson, had done drops like this dozens of times before. Carl had paid him $1,500 up front, with an agreement that Jim would return on August 20th to pick him up. They shook hands on the lakeshore. Jim climbed back into his plane, and within minutes the sound of the engine had faded into the vast silence of the wilderness. Carl stood, alone on the shore with 300 pounds of gear. His cameras, enough food to last until September if he was careful, and a rifle for protection against bears. He felt invincible. He felt alive in a way that he'd never felt in the city. This was freedom. This was what life was supposed to be. What Carl didn't know was that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. A mistake so simple, so mundane, that it would cost him his life. He'd never confirmed the pickup date with the pilot in writing, Jim. Olson had misunderstood. He thought Carl had said August 30th, not August 20th. It was an easy mistake. A simple miscommunication. The kind of thing that would normally be caught with a quick phone call or a follow-up conversation. But there were no phone calls in the wilderness. No way to clarify. No way to correct the error until it was far too late. For the first 5 months, Carl lived exactly the dream he'd imagined. He set up camp near the lake, a tidy arrangement of tents, a cooking area, and a makeshift darkroom where he could develop film. He photographed grizzly bears fishing for salmon, caribou moving across the tundra, wolves hunting in packs. His journals from this period are filled with wonder and enthusiasm. He wrote about the clarity of the air, the quality of the light, the profound sense of connection he felt with the natural world. But someone else was watching Carl, someone who had been watching the remote lake area for years, someone who understood the rhythms of the bush better than any map could convey. Daniel Kroger wasn't technically supposed to be in Alaska at all. He'd fled to the state in 1977 after allegations of sexual abuse surfaced at the youth camp he'd run in Idaho. Daniel had been a counselor there, then director, a position of trust and authority. He was charismatic, athletic, deeply religious. Parents had loved him. Kids had looked up to him. But 3 boys had finally worked up the courage to tell someone what Daniel had been doing to them in the camp's isolation cabin, and suddenly his carefully constructed life had collapsed. He'd vanished before charges could be filed, drove north through Canada, crossed into Alaska through a remote border crossing, and disappeared into the wilderness. For 4 years, he'd been living off the grid, moving between abandoned trappers' cabins, hunting and fishing, occasionally working under false names for hunting outfitters who didn't ask too many questions. He'd established several camps throughout the interior, places he could retreat to when he needed to disappear. Completely. One of those camps was on the north shore of the same lake where Carl Mickcon had been dropped off. Daniel had spotted the bush plane on March 24th. He'd watched through binoculars as the photographer set up camp on the south shore, maybe 3 miles away. At first, Daniel had been angry. His lake, his territory, his solitude invaded by some tourist playing at wilderness survival. But as the days passed and he observed Carl's routine, his anger transformed into something else. Curiosity, interest, and eventually, a darker impulse. Daniel began making careful scouting trips, moving through the forest to get closer to Carl's camp without being detected. He was good at this. Years of hunting had taught him how to move silently, how to read the wind, how to remain invisible even in sparse cover. He learned Carl's schedule: morning photography sessions, midday camp maintenance, evening writing in his journal. He noticed that Carl was alone, completely alone. No partner, no radio that Daniel could see, no regular contact with the outside world. The isolation gave Daniel ideas, dark ideas that he'd been suppressing since fleeing Idaho. Out here, there were no witnesses, no parents to ask questions, no authorities to investigate, just the wilderness and whatever Daniel chose to do in it. On June 7th, Daniel made his first direct contact. He approached Carl's camp in the early morning, calling out a friendly greeting when he was still 50 yards away. The protocol of wilderness encounters: never startle someone who might be holding a rifle. Carl was stunned to see another human being. Daniel introduced himself as Dan Parker, a trapper who had a cabin a few miles north. They talked for over an hour. Carl was hungry for conversation after months of solitude. He told Daniel all about his project, showed him some of his photographs, explained his plans to stay through August. Daniel listened, nodded, asked thoughtful questions. He was charming, friendly. He mentioned that he was a former youth minister, something he said with just the right touch of humble pride. Carl found himself relaxing around this man, grateful for the unexpected companionship. Daniel visited 3 more times over the next month. He brought fish he'd caught, offered to help with camp chores, shared stories about life in the Alaskan bush. Carl began to think of him as a friend, maybe the only friend he'd made since arriving in Alaska. He wrote in his journal about how fortunate he was to have met someone so knowledgeable, so helpful, so genuinely kind. He didn't notice the way Daniel's eyes lingered on him, didn't recognize the predatory calculation behind the friendly smile, didn't understand that he was being groomed, assessed, prepared for something terrible. On July 15th, Daniel's visits stopped. He simply didn't come by anymore. Carl was disappointed, but not alarmed. He figured his neighbor had moved on to a different part of the territory, following game or checking distant trap lines. The wilderness was like that. People came and went. August 20th arrived. Carl packed up most of his gear, organized his film, and wrote final entries in his journal. He was ready to go home, ready to develop his photographs, share his experiences, start planning his next adventure. He waited by the lakeshore, watching the sky for the sound of Jim Olsen's plane. The plane didn't come. Carl waited all day. At first he was just confused, then worried. By evening, he was frightened. He spent a sleepless night running through possibilities. Maybe the weather had delayed the flight. Maybe Jim was sick. Maybe there was a mechanical problem with the plane. He told himself that the pilot would come the next day, but the next day passed without a plane. And the next. And the next, by August 25th, Carl's worry had transformed into panic. He began building signal fires, arranging rocks into massive SOS patterns on the lakeshore, setting up reflective surfaces to catch sunlight. He fired his rifle into the air whenever he heard a distant engine, hoping someone might hear and investigate. He wrote desperate entries in his journal, trying to understand what had gone wrong, trying to calculate how long his remaining food would last. That's when Daniel returned. He walked into camp on August 27th, acting surprised to still find Carl there. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he said. Carl explained the situation. The pilot hadn't come. Something had gone wrong. He needed help. Maybe Daniel could hike out, reach a town, send word to the authorities that someone was stranded. He would pay for the help, whatever it cost. Daniel listened carefully. Then he shook his head. "Can't do it," he said. "I've got my own situation to worry about. Can't afford to draw attention from the authorities right now, if you know what I mean." Carl didn't know what he meant, but he was too desperate to press the issue. He begged. Daniel remained unmoved. "Tell you what," Daniel finally said. "I'll check back in a week. If you're still here, maybe we can figure something out." He left. Carl was alone again, but now his fear had a new dimension. He wasn't just worried about the pilot. He was beginning to understand that he might actually die out here, that he might have made a fatal error in judgment. His journal entries from late August are heartbreaking to read. They oscillate between hope and despair, between rational problem-solving and existential terror. Daniel did return, exactly 1 week later, but he didn't come to help. He came to watch, to observe Carl's deterioration, to satisfy whatever twisted compulsion had been driving him since fleeing Idaho. He found Carl weaker, thinner, more desperate. The photographer had been rationing his food severely, trying to make it last as long as possible. He'd shot a ptarmigan with his rifle, but hunting required energy he didn't have. The summer was ending. Temperatures were dropping at night. Soon the lake would start to freeze. Still no plane, Daniel observed. "Please," Carl said. "Please help me. I'll give you everything I have. All my camera equipment. All my money when we get back. Just help me get out of here." Daniel considered the offer. Then he shook his head. "I don't think so. I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Something in his tone made Carl's blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "The wilderness has a way of sorting people out," Daniel said. "Some people are meant to survive. Others aren't. I think you're in the second category." "You're insane," Carl whispered. Daniel smiled. "Maybe, or maybe I'm the only sane one out here. You came to the wilderness looking for something authentic, right? Well, this is it. This is as authentic as it gets. Just you and nature and the very real possibility of death. No rescue, no safety net. Just the truth of your own weakness." He left Carl there, shaking and terrified. But he didn't leave the area. He set up camp a half-mile away, close enough to keep tabs on his victim, far enough to remain hidden. Over the next 6 weeks, he visited periodically, always bringing just enough supplies to keep Carl alive, but never enough to give him any real hope of survival. A can of beans, a single fish, just enough to prolong the suffering. Carl's journal entries from September and October are almost unbearable to read. He writes about hunger, about cold, about the terrible psychological torture of being so close to help, yet completely abandoned. He writes about Daniel, trying to understand why someone would be so cruel. He writes letters to his family, explaining what happened, apologizing for his mistakes. He writes goodbye messages. He writes prayers. On October 18th, a pilot named Randy Peterson was flying a surveying route when he spotted something unusual on a remote lake. Signal fires. SOS markers. He circled lower and saw a figure waving frantically from the shore. He landed on the lake and found Carl Mickun, barely alive, weighing maybe 90 pounds, unable to walk without assistance. Carl was hysterical with relief. He tried to explain everything at once. The missed pickup, the man who'd been torturing him, the need to send help. Randy got him into the plane, wrapped him in emergency blankets, and flew him directly to Fairbanks Hospital. Carl survived, but barely. He spent 3 weeks in intensive care being treated for severe malnutrition, hypothermia, and psychological trauma. When he was finally able to give a coherent statement to the authorities, he told them everything about Daniel Kroger, though he knew him only as Dan Parker. The Alaska State Troopers launched an immediate investigation. They flew to the lake, found Carl's abandoned camp, and began searching for any sign of the man who had left him to die. They found Daniel's camp on the North Shore. They found supplies. They found a journal that Daniel had kept, filled with disturbing entries about watching Carl deteriorate, about the pleasure he took in denying help, about his philosophy that the wilderness was a place where he could finally act on his truest impulses without consequence. They also found identification documents hidden in a waterproof bag, driver's licenses from 3 different states, all with different names, and newspaper clippings about Daniel Kroger wanted in Idaho for child sexual abuse. A manhunt began. Daniel had fled when Randy's plane landed, disappearing into the forest with practiced efficiency. Search teams scoured the area for weeks. They found tracks, abandoned campsites, evidence that Daniel was moving northeast toward the Canadian border. But the wilderness was vast, and Daniel knew how to use it. He evaded capture for 3 months. In January 1982, a trapper named Louis Denton found a body in a remote cabin near the 40-mile river. The man had frozen to death, apparently overcome by carbon monoxide from a faulty heater while he slept. Identification found at the scene confirmed it was Daniel Kroger. His journal, found beside the body, contained dozens of entries about his time in Alaska. And the entries revealed something far worse than what had happened to Carl McCunn. Daniel hadn't just been living in isolation. He'd been hunting. Over 4 years, he'd made contact with at least 7 other solo wilderness travelers. Young men, mostly, though 2 were women. He'd befriended them, gained their trust, and then either sabotaged their survival efforts or simply watched as they succumbed to the elements. His journal described each encounter in clinical detail, analyzing his own psychological responses, exploring the philosophy that had emerged from his twisted religious background. He believed that the wilderness was a testing ground, that God had placed him there to administer judgment, that those who died had been deemed unworthy of survival. 2 of his victims had apparently survived, though Daniel's journal didn't record what happened to them after they left Alaska. 5 others hadn't been so lucky. The journal included locations, dates, and enough details for investigators to identify the victims. Search teams were dispatched to the remote sites Daniel had described. They found 3 bodies. A kayaker from Oregon Hood, vanished in 1978. A wildlife researcher from Colorado who'd disappeared in 1979. A photographer from California who'd gone missing in 1980. All of them had been reported missing. All of them had been presumed lost to accidents or animal attacks. None of them had been connected to each other until Daniel's journal revealed the truth. 2 other victims mentioned in the journal were never found. Their families were notified. Searches were conducted. But the wilderness kept those secrets. The investigation expanded as detectives dug deeper into Daniel Kroger's past. They discovered that he'd been suspected in several disappearances in Idaho and Montana before fleeing to Alaska, though there had never been enough evidence to charge him. They found connections between Daniel and a network of individuals who shared his ideology, a loose association of religious extremists who believed that the wilderness was a place of divine judgment, where the weak were meant to perish and the strong were meant to thrive. Several names emerged from Daniel's papers and correspondence. A former missionary who ran wilderness therapy programs in Montana, a hunting guide in British Columbia who'd been investigated multiple times for negligence in client deaths, a pastor in Washington who ran survival camps for troubled youth. All of them shared similar philosophies. All of them had access to vulnerable people in remote locations. The FBI formed a task force in 1983 to investigate what they began calling the Wilderness Theology Network. Investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of deaths across multiple states and provinces, stretching back nearly 2 decades. Drownings, exposure deaths, bear attacks, equipment failures. Each incident had been ruled accidental at the time. But when investigators started connecting the dots, patterns emerged. The victims had often been young men with troubled backgrounds. Many had been participants in religious wilderness programs, and several had last been seen with individuals who were part of Daniel Kroger's network. Carl McCunn testified before a grand jury in 1984. His testimony combined with evidence from Daniel's journal and the investigation into the network, led to indictments of 6 individuals across 4 states. 3 were convicted of various charges ranging from negligent homicide to second-degree murder. 2 were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. 1 fled to South America and has never been apprehended. But the investigation didn't end with those convictions, because Daniel's journal contained references to others who shared his beliefs, who were operating in remote areas, who were continuing the work that he'd started. Names were mentioned but never fully recorded. Locations were hinted at but never specified. The journal suggested that the network was larger than investigators had initially believed, that it extended beyond the handful of individuals who'd been identified, that it might still be active. The task force continues its work today, now operating under the designation Operation Wilderness Theology. They investigate suspicious deaths in remote areas. They track individuals with histories of abuse who've relocated to wilderness regions. They coordinate with Canadian authorities, with park services, with bush pilots and guides who might encounter suspicious activity. New information arrives periodically. A deathbed confession from a hunting guide in Wyoming. An anonymous tip about a survival camp in northern British Columbia. A hiker who reports a disturbing encounter with someone offering unsolicited help in a remote area. Each lead is investigated. Each possibility is explored. Carl Mitkun recovered physically from his ordeal, though the psychological scars never fully healed. He never returned to Alaska. He never went into the wilderness alone again. He spent years in therapy, trying to process what had happened to him, trying to understand how someone could be so calculatedly cruel. He became an advocate for wilderness safety, giving talks about the importance of proper planning, clear communication, and understanding that the wilderness attracts not just adventurers, but also those fleeing from justice. He died in 2019 at the age of 73. His journals and photographs from that terrible summer in 1981 were donated to the Alaska State Archives, where they serve as a primary source for ongoing investigations into Daniel Kroger and the Wilderness Theology Network. The story of Carl Mitkun is a reminder that the greatest danger in the wilderness isn't always bears or weather or getting lost. Sometimes the greatest danger is the person offering to help, the friendly face in an isolated place, the stranger who appears when you're most vulnerable, because evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears the face of a concerned neighbor. Sometimes it quotes scripture while watching you starve. Sometimes it believes, with absolute conviction, that cruelty is a form of divine service. And sometimes the wilderness isn't empty at all. Sometimes it's full of people who've chosen isolation for very dark reasons. People who use the vastness of the landscape to hide not just from the law, but from any form of human accountability. Carl survived because a pilot happened to fly over at the right time. But how many others weren't so lucky? How many signal fires went unseen? How many SOS markers were hidden by snow? How many people died alone in the wilderness, not knowing that their deaths weren't accidents at all, but murders disguised as the inevitable hazards of backcountry travel? The investigation continues. The wilderness slowly reveals its secrets. And somewhere in the vast forests and tundra of Alaska and beyond, there may still be others who believe what Daniel Kroger believed, who watch solo travelers with predatory interest, who see the wilderness not as a place of beauty, but as a place where they can finally act on their darkest impulses without fear of consequences. The task force keeps working. The searches continue. and the families of those who vanished wait for answers that may never come, while the wilderness keeps its counsel, silent and vast and full of terrible secrets that it has no intention of surrendering easily. Story 3, Sharon Gay. Biz was 42 years old when she decided to paddle the Kenai River in July of 1993. She was an experienced outdoorswoman, a high school biology teacher from Anchorage who spent every summer exploring Alaska's waterways. She'd kayaked the Inside Passage, canoed the Yukon River tributaries, and rafted sections of the Copper River that most people considered too dangerous for recreational boating. Sharon wasn't reckless, but she wasn't timid either. She understood risk assessment. She knew her limits, and she knew that the Kenai River in mid-July was well within those limits. The Kenai isn't particularly dangerous as Alaskan rivers go. It's popular with tourists, dotted with fishing lodges and guided tours operations. The upper sections have some rapids, but nothing extreme. The middle and lower sections are mostly flat water, meandering through forests and past small communities. Thousands of people paddle it every year without incident. It should have been a routine trip. Sharon launched her canoe from Cooper Landing on July 14th, planning to paddle 60 miles downriver to the town of Sterling over 4 days. She'd reserved campsites at established locations along the route. She had all the proper equipment: life vest, dry bags, emergency supplies, a waterproof bag containing her permits and identification. She'd filed a float plan with the Alaska State Parks Office, listing her intended route and expected completion date. She'd done everything right. She never arrived in Sterling on July 18th, when Sharon failed to appear at the designated takeout point. Park rangers were notified. They initiated a search the same day, checking the river corridor and the campsites Sharon had reserved. They found no sign of her. No canoe, no gear, no evidence that she'd stopped at any of the designated camping areas. It was as if she'd simply vanished somewhere along that 60-mile stretch of river dot. The search expanded over the following days. Helicopters flew the river corridor. Dive teams checked deeper pools and areas where the current might have trapped a capsized canoe. Rangers hiked the banks, looking for any sign of wreckage or an unplanned campsite. They found nothing. The Kenai River, usually so willing to give up its secrets, remained stubbornly silent. What searchers didn't know was that Sharon Gay Biz had never made it more than 8 miles downriver from Cooper Landing, and the reason for her disappearance had nothing to do with the river itself. Walter Brennan had been living in Cooper Landing for 15 years when Sharon paddled through town. He ran a small fishing guide service and served as a deacon at the Cooper Landing Community Church, a tiny congregation that met in a converted storage building every Sunday morning. Walter was well liked in the community. He was 61 years old, a Vietnam veteran who'd moved to Alaska in the late 70s, seeking peace and solitude. He had a gentle demeanor, a patient teaching style that made him popular with clients, and a reputation for honesty that made him trusted by everyone who knew him. He was also a killer. Walter had developed his ideology during the war. He'd been part of a riverine unit operating in the Mekong Delta, conducting patrols and interdiction missions in small boats. The experience had convinced him that water was sacred, that rivers were the arteries of the earth, and that certain people defiled those waterways simply by using them. He'd kept these beliefs mostly private for decades, but they'd festered and grown more elaborate over time. By 1993, Walter had come to believe that he was a guardian of the rivers, that God had placed him in Alaska to protect the waterways from those who didn't properly respect them. Women traveling alone, in his twisted theology, were particular offenders. They represented disorder, chaos, a violation of natural hierarchies. When Walter saw Sharon Gay Biz preparing her canoe at the Cooper Landing boat launch on the morning of July 14th, something dark activated in his mind. He approached her with a friendly smile, offering local knowledge about river conditions. Sharon was grateful for the advice. They talked for 10 minutes about the best campsites, the locations where moose were most commonly seen, the sections where the current picked up. Walter mentioned that he'd be guiding a fishing trip downriver that afternoon, and that he might see her along the way. Sharon waved goodbye and pushed off from the shore, her red canoe catching the morning light. Walter watched her paddle downstream. Then he made a phone call from the payphone outside the general store. The person on the other end listened without speaking, then hung up without saying goodbye. Walter returned to his truck, loaded his own boat onto the trailer, and drove to a private access point 3 miles downriver. A place where the river curved through dense forest, far from any campgrounds or public areas. A place he'd used before. He launched his boat and waited. When Sharon's canoe appeared around the upstream bend, Walter waved cheerfully and called out a greeting. Sharon recognized him from their earlier conversation and paddled closer, perhaps thinking he had additional advice to share. Walter's boat drifted alongside hers. They talked for a moment about the beauty of the day, the clarity of the water. Then Walter grabbed the gunwale of Sharon's canoe and capsized it in one violent motion. Sharon went into the water, weighed down by her life vest but disoriented by the sudden immersion. Before she could recover, Walter was on her, his hands round her throat, pushing her under. She fought, but he was stronger and he had leverage from his boat. The struggle lasted less than a minute. When Sharon stopped moving, Walter held her under for another 30 seconds to be certain. Then he methodically destroyed the evidence. He secured Sharon's body with weights taken from his tackle box and pushed it into a deep pool beneath an overhanging bank, a spot where the current created a natural trap for anything that sank there. He retrieved her canoe, which had drifted only a few yards downstream, and towed it to shore. Over the next hour, he dismantled it with tools from his truck. He cut the aluminum hull into sections, crushed and bagged her camping gear, and distributed the pieces across multiple dumpsters and remote locations over the following days. Sharon's body stayed in the pool beneath the bank, hidden in dark water, held in place by current and terrain. It would remain there for years, gradually becoming part of the river sediment. Bones scattered by spring floods, any evidence of violence erased by time and water. Walter returned to his normal life. He guided fishing trips. He attended church services. He counseled troubled young people through the church's youth ministry program. His wife, Denise, who was the sister of Cooper Landing's mayor, never suspected that her husband had murdered someone. How could she? Walter was gentle. Walter was kind. Walter was a man of God. But Walter wasn't alone in his beliefs. The person he'd called from the payphone was a hunting guide named Marcus Price, who operated out of a lodge 30 miles north of Cooper Landing. Marcus shared Walter's twisted theology about protecting Alaska's wilderness from those he deemed unworthy. Over the years, the two men had developed a system. Walter would identify potential targets among river travelers. Marcus would provide support, disposal, assistance, and occasionally handle his own corrections, as they called them, between 1987 and 1993. At least 6 people who'd put in at Cooper Landing for river trips had disappeared without a trace. All of them were solo female travelers. All of them had been reported missing. All of them had been assumed to have drowned or capsized in areas where bodies might never be recovered. Alaska had hundreds of such cases. The statistics were grim but not particularly unusual for a state where wilderness recreation was common and conditions could be unforgiving. Nobody connected the disappearances because they occurred across different years, involved different rivers, and had no obvious pattern beyond gender and solo travel status. Nobody thought to look at the common factor. All of them had launched from or near Cooper Landing. All of them had likely encountered Walter Brennan. The case of Sharon Gay Biz might have remained unsolved forever if not for a stroke of fortune in 2004, 11 years after her disappearance. A documentary filmmaker named Patricia Chen was shooting footage for a project about Alaska's missing persons cases. She interviewed dozens of family members, law enforcement officials, and local residents. One of those residents was a woman named Helen Kavech, who'd worked at the Cooper Landing General Store for 30 years. Helen mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd always thought it was odd how many solo women had gone missing after launching from Cooper Landing. She couldn't remember all the names, but she remembered the pattern. The filmmaker asked follow-up questions. Helen provided what details she could recall. Patricia started researching. What she found was striking. Between 1987 and 1993, 6 solo female paddlers had disappeared after departing from Cooper Landing. The statistical probability of this concentration in such a small geographic area was astronomical. Patricia brought her findings to the Alaska State Troopers. A detective named Sarah Lundgren began investigating. Detective Lundgren started by interviewing everyone who'd been working in Cooper Landing during that period. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing Walter Brennan talking to some of the missing women at the boat launch. He was a guide, after all. It would have been natural for him to offer advice, but the frequency of these encounters was notable. Lundgren obtained warrants for Walter's phone records from the relevant years. The records showed repeated calls to Marcus Price on dates that corresponded with the disappearances. In August 2004, investigators executed search warrants on both men's properties. At Walter's home, they found journals dating back to the late 70s. The entries were cryptic, written in a personal code, but investigators were able to decipher enough to understand that Walter had been documenting his crimes for decades. References to purification rituals, notes about returning the unworthy to the water, dates that matched missing persons reports at Marcus Price's hunting lodge. They found a locked storage unit containing items that had belonged to several missing persons. Identification documents, jewelry, camping equipment. The investigators also found correspondence between Walter and Marcus discussing their shared beliefs, their methods, and their conviction that they were doing God's work. Both men were arrested on August 23, 2004, faced with overwhelming evidence. Walter Brennan confessed to murdering Sharon Gay Biz and 5 other women over a period of 16 years. Marcus Price confessed to his role in covering up the crimes, and to murdering 2 solo male hikers who he believed had disrespected the wilderness by leaving trash at campsites. The trial began in March 2005. The prosecution presented the journals, the physical evidence, and the confessions. The defense attempted to argue that the confessions had been coerced, and that the journal entries were fictional writings, not actual accounts of crimes. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Walter Brennan and Marcus Price were each sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. But, as with so many of these cases, the convictions didn't provide complete answers. Walter's journals referenced others in the network, names that were never fully spelled out, locations that were described but not precisely identified. The investigators found evidence of communication with at least 4 other individuals who seemed to share Walter and Marcus's ideology. One of those individuals was identified as a pastor in Soldotna who ran a wilderness ministry program. Another was a park ranger in Denali who had access to backcountry permit information. A third was a bush pilot who operated throughout the interior. The fourth remained unidentified, referred to in the journals only as the Shepherd. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation formed a task force to investigate these connections. They called it Operation Riverwatch. Over the next several years, the task force reviewed hundreds of missing persons cases across Alaska, looking for patterns that might indicate additional victims or additional perpetrators. They identified at least 17 suspicious disappearances that bore similarities to the cases linked to Walter Brennan and Marcus Price. Searches were conducted at locations referenced in Walter's journals. In 2006, divers found human remains in the pool where Walter had hidden Sharon Gay Biz's body. Forensic analysis confirmed her identity through dental records. Her family finally had closure, though the knowledge of how she died brought no comfort. Other victims were eventually recovered from locations described in the journals. 3 more were never found. The Kenai River, despite extensive searches, kept those secrets. The investigation expanded beyond Alaska. Detectives discovered that Walter Brennan had lived in Oregon and Washington before moving north, and that unsolved disappearances of solo female campers had occurred in areas where he'd resided. Marcus Price had worked as a guide in Montana and British Columbia, and similar patterns emerged there. The scope of the network was larger than anyone had initially imagined. As of today, Operation Riverwatch continues its work. The task force coordinates with law enforcement across multiple states and provinces. They've identified 3 additional suspects, though evidence sufficient for prosecution has been difficult to obtain. The pastor in Soldotna died in 2008 before charges could be filed. The park ranger in Denali was questioned extensively but never charged due to insufficient evidence. The bush pilot is currently under surveillance. The Shepherd remains unidentified. References in Walter's journals suggest this person was the ideological center of the network, the one who'd articulated the theology that justified the murders. Investigators believe the Shepherd may have been someone with significant religious authority, possibly someone who operated a wilderness program or retreat center where vulnerable people could be isolated and targeted. The search for the Shepherd continues. New evidence arrives periodically, examined carefully by the task force. Anonymous tips, deathbed statements, documents discovered in storage units or estate sales. Each piece of information is investigated thoroughly, added to the growing file on a network that operated in the shadows of Alaska's wilderness for decades. Sharon Gay Biz wanted to paddle the Kenai River, to experience the beauty and solitude of Alaska's waterways. Instead, she encountered evil disguised as kindness, murder disguised as accident, and a network of killers who believed they were protecting the wilderness by destroying those they deemed unworthy of experiencing it. Her story, and the stories of the others who disappeared, serve as a reminder that monsters don't always live in the wilderness. Sometimes they live beside it, wearing the faces of guides and deacons and helpful neighbors, waiting for opportunities to act on their darkest beliefs in places where evidence disappears with the current and where the vastness of the landscape makes investigation almost impossible. The rivers of Alaska continue to flow. The task force continues to work, and somewhere, possibly still operating, the shepherd watches and waits, protected by distance and by the terrible silence of those who've never come home. Story 4. Richard Griffiths was 27 years old when he drove his Jeep Cherokee into the Wrangell St. Elias National Park on August 3rd, 1996. He'd been planning the trip for months, saving money from his job as a software engineer in Seattle, studying maps, reading everything he could find about the largest national park in the United States. Wrangell St. Elias covered over 13 million acres, an area larger than Switzerland, containing some of the most remote and rugged terrain in North America. It was exactly the kind of challenge Richard had been seeking. He wasn't inexperienced. Richard had hiked extensively throughout the Cascades and Olympics. He'd summited Rainier twice. He'd done multi-week backpacking trips in the Sierra Nevada and the Colorado Rockies. But Alaska was different. Alaska was bigger, wilder, less forgiving. Richard respected that. He'd spent months preparing, getting his gear dialed in, improving his physical conditioning, learning about the specific challenges of Alaskan backcountry travel. His plan was to hike the Goat Trail, a remote route that wound through the northern section of the park, crossing several glacial rivers and climbing over high passes with spectacular views of the Wrangell Mountains. The trail was primitive, barely marked in places, requiring strong navigation skills and self-sufficiency. It was perfect for someone like Richard, who wanted to test himself against genuine wilderness. He checked in at the ranger station on August 3rd, filed his itinerary, and spoke with Ranger Thomas Millbrook about current conditions. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. Thomas went over the route, pointed out areas where river crossings might be difficult, reminded Richard about bear safety protocols. Everything seemed routine. Richard seemed well prepared, confident, but not arrogant. Thomas approved his backcountry permit and wished him luck. Richard drove to the trailhead at McCarthy, parked his Jeep in the designated area, shouldered his pack, and walked into the wilderness. He was due back on August 17th, 2 weeks later. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. What Richard didn't know was that Ranger Thomas Millbrook had been watching him very carefully during their conversation. Thomas had a system for identifying certain types of visitors: young men traveling alone, physically fit, confident in their abilities, following routes that took them far from established trails and popular areas. Richard fit the profile perfectly. Thomas Millbrook had been a ranger at Wrangell St. Elias for 8 years. Before that, he'd worked at parks in Montana and Wyoming. He had an impeccable service record, commendations for search and rescue operations, and a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable rangers in the Alaska park system. He was married to the niece of a state senator, a connection that had helped his career advancement. He taught wilderness survival courses in the off-season. He'd written articles for outdoor magazines about backcountry safety. He was also a predator who'd been killing hikers for over a decade. Thomas had developed his ideology during his first ranger posting in Glacier National Park. He'd been part of multiple body recoveries, pulling dead hikers out of crevasses, finding frozen corpses on exposed ridges. searching for people who'd simply vanished into the mountains. The experience had transformed something in his psychology. He'd begun to see himself as a kind of agent of natural selection, someone who could identify the weak and ensure they never returned from the wilderness. He believed he was serving a higher purpose, maintaining the purity of wild places by removing those who didn't truly belong there. His position as a ranger gave him perfect cover. He had access to backcountry permits and itineraries. He knew exactly where people would be and when they'd be there. He could travel anywhere in the park without arousing suspicion. If someone went missing, he'd often be part of the search and rescue operation, able to steer investigations away from anything that might implicate him. It was the perfect hunting ground. Richard Griffiths made good progress on his first day, covering 12 miles and setting up camp near a glacial stream. He was feeling strong, excited about the days ahead. He cooked dinner, wrote in his journal, and fell asleep to the sound of water rushing over rocks. Thomas Millbrook reached Richard's camp at 2 in the morning, moving silently through the darkness using night vision equipment. He'd done this many times before. He knew exactly how to approach a tent without waking the occupant. He knew where to strike to ensure unconsciousness before resistance was possible. Richard woke to blinding pain in his head and Thomas's gloved hand covering his mouth. He tried to fight, but Thomas was prepared, experienced. He zip-tied Richard's wrists and ankles, gagged him with duct tape, and dragged him out of the tent. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. Thomas had a spot prepared, a small depression about a mile from Richard's camp, hidden in dense brush near the base of a rock face. He'd cached supplies there weeks earlier: rope, tools, a tarp. He dragged Richard to this location and secured him to a tree. Then he returned to Richard's campsite. He packed up everything methodically: the tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, food, clothing. He loaded it all into a large backpack that he'd brought specifically for this purpose. He scattered the campfire remains, brushed away footprints, arranged the site to look like Richard had simply packed up and continued hiking. When he was finished, there was no evidence anyone had ever camped there. Thomas returned to Richard just as dawn was breaking. The young man was conscious now, terrified, trying to scream through the gag. Thomas sat on a rock nearby and explained his philosophy. He spoke calmly, almost gently, about natural selection and wilderness purity, about how some people were meant to survive in wild places and others weren't, about how he was simply fulfilling nature's will by removing those who didn't belong. "You have good gear," Thomas said, "good physical conditioning, but you lack something essential. I can see it in your eyes. You came here seeking adventure, but you don't truly understand what the wilderness is. You think it's a playground, a challenge to overcome. That's why you don't belong here." Richard tried to plead through the gag, his eyes streaming with tears. Thomas ignored him. He pulled out a hunting knife and cut the zip ties binding Richard's ankles. "We're going to take a hike," Thomas said. "If you try to run, I'll shoot you in the spine and let you die slowly. If you cooperate, this will be quick and relatively painless. Your choice." They walked for 3 hours, climbing higher into the mountains, following a route that Richard would never have taken voluntarily. Thomas knew this terrain intimately. He'd been scouting it for years, identifying locations where bodies would never be found. Crevasses hidden beneath snow bridges, deep ravines filled with loose scree, areas where rockfall was common enough that a body could be buried naturally within months. They reached Thomas's chosen spot just after noon. It was a narrow canyon with walls of crumbling rock, the bottom choked with boulders and debris. Thomas removed Richard's gag. "Any last words?" he asked. Richard tried to reason with him, begged for his life, promised he'd never tell anyone what had happened. Thomas listened patiently, then shook his head. "You still don't understand," he said. "This isn't personal. This is about maintaining order, about ensuring that only those who truly belong in the wilderness get to experience it." He pushed Richard off a ledge into the canyon below. The fall was 30 feet onto rocks. Richard died on impact. Thomas climbed down, confirmed the death, and spent the next hour covering the body with rocks. When he was finished, Richard Griffiths was buried under tons of stone in a location so remote that even experienced mountaineers would never venture there. Thomas hiked back to civilization over the next 2 days. He disposed of Richard's gear in various locations throughout the park, scattering items across dozens of miles. The tent in one drainage, the sleeping bag in another, the pack hidden in a rock crevice 20 miles from where Richard had last been seen. He kept only one item as a trophy, Richard's journal, which he stored in a locked cabinet at his home along with items from his previous victims. On August 17th, when Richard failed to check in, Thomas was part of the search and rescue operation. He led teams along Richard's intended route, acting concerned and professional. They found no trace of the missing hiker. After 3 weeks, the search was suspended. Richard Griffiths was added to the long list of people who'd vanished in Wrangell St. Elias National Park. Richard's parents flew to Alaska, pleading for continued searches. Thomas met with them, expressed his sympathy, gently explained how vast the park was and how many ways someone could disappear. He suggested that Richard might have fallen into a crevasse, been caught in rockfall, or drowned crossing a glacial river. The parents returned to Seattle without answers, devastated but resigned to never knowing exactly what had happened to their son. Thomas continued his work as a ranger. He continued teaching wilderness survival courses. He continued killing. Over the next 5 years, 3 more solo hikers vanished in Wrangell St. Elias under his watch. All of them had filed itineraries with Thomas. All of them had disappeared along remote routes. None of them were ever found. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for a mistake Thomas made in 2001. He'd targeted a hiker named Scott Vega, a 24-year-old from California planning a solo traverse of the Bagley Icefield. Thomas followed his usual procedure, but what he didn't know was that Scott had a satellite GPS device that his father had insisted he'd bring. The device transmitted Scott's position every hour to a server that his family could access. When Scott vanished, his family provided the GPS data to investigators. The track showed Scott's steady progress along his intended route, then an inexplicable deviation eastward into terrain that made no sense for his planned trip. The final transmission came from a location 5 miles off Scott's route, in an area of steep canyons and rock faces. Search teams focused on this area. They didn't find Scott, but they found something else: equipment from other missing hikers. A tent that matched the description of gear Richard Griffiths had been carrying. A sleeping bag that belonged to a woman who'd vanished in 1998. Boot prints that showed someone had visited this remote location repeatedly over several years. The investigation intensified. A special agent from the National Park Service Criminal Investigation Branch named David Chen began reviewing all missing persons cases in parks where Thomas Millbrook had worked. The pattern was undeniable. Solo hikers vanishing at rates significantly higher than in comparable parks. Thomas had been present at the ranger stations, where all of them had filed their itineraries. In September 2002, investigators executed a search warrant on Thomas's home. They found the locked cabinet containing journals and items from victims. The journals documented 12 murders across 3 national parks over 14 years. Detailed accounts of each killing, complete with dates, locations, and Thomas's theological justifications for his actions. Thomas Millbrook was arrested and charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder. He showed no remorse during questioning, explaining his ideology calmly and rationally. He believed he'd been serving the wilderness, protecting it from those who didn't truly belong. The trial in 2003 was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Thomas was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without parole. But even in custody, he refused to reveal the exact locations where he'd hidden all the bodies. He gave investigators general areas, but withheld specific coordinates. Maintaining one final measure of control, recovery operations continue in Wrangell, St. Elias and the other parks where Thomas operated. 4 bodies have been found, including Richard Griffith's in 2005. 8 remain missing. Their families still waiting for closure that may never come. The wilderness keeps those secrets, protected by distance and terrain and the sheer impossibility of searching. Millions of acres of remote landscape. The investigation also revealed that Thomas had been in communication with others who shared his twisted ideology. Names appeared in his journals, references to a network. A task force was formed to investigate these connections, but progress has been slow. The wilderness attracts those seeking isolation, and some of them bring dark purposes to that solitude. Richard Griffiths wanted to test himself against the wilderness. Instead, he encountered a different kind of danger, one he never could have anticipated. His story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats in the backcountry aren't natural at all. Story 5. Verna. Van Zee was 53 years old when she pulled her Honda sedan into a scenic overlook on the Seward Highway on the afternoon of September 12, 2002. She was driving from Anchorage to Seward, a route she'd traveled dozens of times over the 15 years she'd lived in Alaska. Verna was a librarian at the Anchorage Public Library, a quiet woman who lived alone in a small apartment downtown and spent her weekends exploring the state's highways and coastal areas. She wasn't adventurous in the extreme sports sense, but she loved photography and often stopped at pull-outs to capture the changing light on Turnagain Arm or the distant glaciers hanging in the Chugach Mountains. The Seward Highway is one of Alaska's most scenic routes, designated an All-American road for its spectacular views. It's also well-traveled, especially during summer and early fall. Hundreds of cars pass along it daily. The idea that someone could vanish from a highway pullout in broad daylight seemed impossible. Yet that's exactly what happened to Verna Van Zee. She'd called her sister in Anchorage at 2:15 that afternoon, mentioning she'd stopped to photograph the fall colors. The call lasted 3 minutes. Verna sounded happy, relaxed. She said she'd be in Seward by 5 and would call again that evening. She never made that call. When Verna didn't arrive in Seward and didn't answer her phone that evening, her sister grew worried. By 10 p.m., she'd contacted the Alaska State Troopers. A patrol unit was dispatched to drive the Seward Highway, looking for Verna's car. They found it at 3:30 a.m., parked at a pullout near mile 82. about halfway between Anchorage and Seward. The car was locked. Verna's purse was inside, along with her camera bag. Her phone was on the passenger seat, powered off. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened. The troopers searched the immediate area with flashlights, but found nothing. At first light, they expanded the search. Teams walked the shoreline of Turnagain Arm below the pullout, checked the forest on the uphill side, questioned other travelers who'd been on the highway that afternoon. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Nobody remembered seeing Verna. Search and rescue operations continued for 2 weeks. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the area. Dive teams searched the frigid waters of Turnagain Arm. Though it seemed unlikely Verna would have tried to climb down the steep, rocky slope to reach the water, volunteers walked transect through the forest. Nothing. Verna Van Zee had simply vanished. What investigators didn't know was that Verna's disappearance had been carefully planned by someone who'd been watching her for months. Brother Samuel Marks ran a small Christian retreat center called Haven of Rest, about 15 miles from where Verna's car was found. The center offered spiritual counseling, meditation, workshops, and wilderness retreats for people seeking deeper connection with God. Brother Samuel was beloved in the local religious community. He was 58 years old, a former missionary who'd spent 20 years in South America before returning to Alaska to establish his ministry. He had endorsements from several churches in Anchorage. He was connected through marriage to a district court judge, giving him a certain credibility and access to information that others wouldn't have. But Brother Samuel had a dark secret. He believed that certain people, particularly women who lived alone and showed signs of independence from traditional family structures, were infected with a spiritual corruption that needed to be cleansed. He saw himself as an instrument of divine correction, someone called to remove these corrupting influences from the community through any means necessary. He'd first noticed Verna at the library 6 months earlier when he'd been researching materials for a sermon. Something about her had triggered his twisted theology. She was unmarried, living alone, self-sufficient. In Brother Samuel's worldview, this represented a dangerous deviation from God's intended order. He began watching her, learning her routines, noting that she often drove to Seward on weekends. On September 12th, Brother Samuel had been parked at the pullout where Verna's car would later be found. He was driving the retreat center's white van, which bore religious symbols and the name of his ministry. When Verna pulled in to take photographs, he approached her with a friendly smile, introducing himself and asking if she needed any assistance. Verna, seeing the religious markings on his van and his clerical collar, felt comfortable speaking with him. They talked about photography, about the beauty of the Alaskan landscape, about faith and solitude. Brother Samuel was charming, eloquent. He mentioned that his retreat center was nearby and invited Verna to visit sometime. She politely declined, saying she needed to get to Seward before dark. Brother Samuel nodded understandingly, then asked if she'd like to see a better vantage point for photographs. A spot just 100 yards into the forest, where the view of Turnagain Arm was spectacular. Verna hesitated, but Brother Samuel's clerical collar and the religious symbols on his van made him seem trustworthy. She followed him into the trees, carrying her camera. They walked for about 2 minutes before reaching a small clearing. Brother Samuel turned to point out the view, and in that moment of distraction, he struck Verna from behind with a heavy stone he'd concealed in his jacket. Verna collapsed, unconscious. Brother Samuel worked quickly, efficiently. He'd prepared a location deeper in the forest, a natural depression he'd covered with branches and debris. He dragged Verna's body there, killed her with the same stone to ensure she was dead, and buried her in a shallow grave. He covered the site carefully, scattering pine needles and forest litter to make it blend with the surrounding terrain. Then he returned to the pullout. Verna's car was still the only vehicle there. He used a Slim Jim tool to unlock it, retrieved her purse and camera bag, and locked it again. He drove these items to a remote location 20 miles away and disposed of them in a ravine. The entire operation took less than 90 minutes. Brother Samuel returned to his retreat center and resumed his normal activities. That evening, he led a prayer group, counseled a troubled couple, and prepared materials for a weekend workshop. Nobody suspected anything. Why would they? He was a man of God, a respected spiritual leader, someone who devoted his life to helping others find peace and purpose. The investigation into Verna's disappearance continued for months, but produced no leads. The troopers suspected foul play, but had no evidence, no suspects, no witnesses. Verna's sister hired a private investigator who reviewed the case file and came to the same dead end. Eventually, the active investigation was suspended, though the case remained open. Brother Samuel continued his ministry. He continued watching for others who fit his profile of spiritual corruption. Over the next 4 years, 3 more women vanished along Alaska's highway system under similar circumstances. All of them were middle-aged, living alone, last seen at scenic pullouts or rest areas. None of them were ever found. The pattern might never have been detected if not for a former member of Brother Samuel's congregation, who came forward in 2007, Margaret. Cross had left the retreat center after becoming uncomfortable with some of Brother Samuel's teachings about women's roles and divine punishment. She'd kept her concerns private for years, but when she read about another missing woman, something clicked. She contacted the troopers and described Brother Samuel's ideology, his fixation on independent women, and his frequent travels along the highway system. Investigators took another look at Brother Samuel. They reviewed his travel records, credit card receipts, and phone logs. They found that he'd been in the vicinity of all 4 disappearances on the days they occurred. They obtained a warrant to search Haven of Rest. In a locked room in the retreat center's basement, they found journals documenting Brother Samuel's crimes. For murders, described in theological terms as acts of spiritual cleansing, he'd kept items from each victim: Verna's library ID badge, a bracelet from another victim, photographs of all 4 women taken without their knowledge. Brother Samuel was arrested in November 2007. He confessed immediately, explaining his ideology with the calm certainty of someone who believed he'd been following divine will. He showed investigators the general areas where he'd buried his victims, but refused to provide exact locations, claiming that knowledge was between him and God. Search operations were launched. Verna Van Zee's body was found in March 2008, exactly where Brother Samuel had indicated, though he'd been off by about 50 yards in his description. 2 other victims were recovered over the following year. The 4th has never been found. Brother Samuel's trial revealed disturbing connections. He'd been corresponding with others who shared his ideology, including a pastor in Oregon and a counselor at a religious camp in Idaho. Both were investigated. The pastor died before charges could be filed. The counselor was convicted of assault, but not murder due to insufficient evidence. A task force was formed to investigate what authorities began calling the cleansing network, a loose association of religious extremists who believed they were divinely authorized to punish those who deviated from their strict interpretation of proper social order. The investigation continues today, spanning multiple states and involving dozens of unsolved cases. Brother Samuel sits in prison, maintaining his conviction that he acted righteously. Verna Van Zee's sister visits her grave regularly, grateful for closure but haunted by how easily evil had disguised itself as holy purpose. And investigators continue searching for answers about how many others might still be out there, wearing clerical collars and carrying dark intentions, watching for opportunities to act on their twisted beliefs. Story 6. Jerry Parrish was 31 years old when he set out to climb Pioneer Peak in the Chugach Range on June 6, 2008. It was supposed to be a day hike, nothing too ambitious. Pioneer Peak isn't technically difficult, though it's steep and requires good physical conditioning. Jerry had both. He'd been rock climbing for years, had summited several peaks in the Chugach, and knew the area reasonably well. He told his roommate he'd be back by 8 that evening. He never came home. His roommate reported him missing the next morning. Search and rescue teams were deployed immediately. They found Jerry's truck in the trailhead parking lot, but no sign of Jerry himself. The search continued for 10 days, covering the standard route up Pioneer Peak and several alternate paths. They found nothing. No gear, no footprints, no indication of where Jerry had gone after leaving his vehicle. The Alaska Mountain Rescue Group concluded that Jerry had likely fallen from an exposed section of the route, possibly into a crevice or steep gully where his body couldn't be easily spotted from search aircraft. It was a reasonable conclusion. People died on Alaska mountains regularly, and bodies were sometimes never recovered. Jerry's family held a memorial service, grieving but accepting that the mountains had claimed him. But Jerry Parrish hadn't fallen. He'd been murdered by someone who knew the Chugach Range better than anyone else in the region. Wayne Hollister was a wilderness survival instructor who ran a company called Primal Skills Alaska. He taught courses on mountaineering, winter survival, and backcountry emergency response. He was considered one of the top experts in the state, frequently consulted by search and rescue organizations and the National Park Service. He'd written 2 books on Alaska wilderness survival. He was married to the daughter of Anchorage's police chief, a connection that gave him access to information about ongoing investigations and missing persons cases. Wayne had developed a philosophy he called natural accountability. He believed that people who took unnecessary risks in the wilderness were disrespecting nature and needed to face consequences. In his twisted logic, he saw himself as an enforcer of natural law, someone who ensured that those who were unprepared or reckless didn't survive their mistakes. Over time, this philosophy had evolved into something darker. Wayne began creating the very situations he claimed to be punishing. He'd been watching the Pioneer Peak trailhead for weeks, looking for solo climbers who fit his profile. When Jerry Parrish arrived alone on that June morning, Wayne saw an opportunity. He followed Jerry up the trail, staying far enough back to remain unnoticed. Wayne knew a dozen routes up Pioneer Peak, including several that weren't marked on any map. He knew where the terrain became exposed, where a simple push could send someone tumbling into terrain where they'd never be found. About 3 hours into the climb, Wayne caught up with Jerry at a rest point. He introduced himself, mentioned his survival school, and offered some friendly advice about the route ahead. Jerry was grateful for the guidance. They hiked together for the next hour, Wayne gradually steering them away from the standard route toward a more exposed ridge. When they reached a narrow section with steep drops on both sides, Wayne made his move. He shoved Jerry hard from behind, sending him tumbling over the edge into a rocky chute. Jerry fell approximately 200 feet, dying on impact. Wayne climbed down carefully, confirmed the death, and spent the next hour moving Jerry's body into a crevice between two large boulders. He covered the opening with rocks and debris, making it virtually invisible from above. Then Wayne hiked back down the mountain using a different route, one that wouldn't take him past any other hikers. He returned to his truck, which he'd parked at a different trailhead, and drove home. That evening, he taught a wilderness first aid class, showing no signs of what he'd done hours earlier. The search for Jerry Parrish continued without success. Wayne even volunteered to help, using his expertise to suggest areas where the search teams should focus. He steered them away from the location where he'd hidden Jerry's body, instead recommending they concentrate on the standard route where he claimed most accidents occurred. Jerry's disappearance would have remained just another tragic mountain accident if Wayne hadn't continued killing. Over the next 3 years, 5 more solo hikers vanished in the Chugach Range under similar circumstances. All of them were experienced. All of them disappeared on clear days with good conditions. And all of them had been seen talking to Wayne Hollister at trailheads or on trails in the hours before they vanished. A pattern recognition analyst at the Alaska State Troopers named Rebecca Torres noticed the connection. In 2011, she was reviewing missing persons cases and saw Wayne's name appearing repeatedly in witness statements and search reports. She brought her findings to investigators, who began looking more closely at Wayne's background and movements. They discovered that Wayne had been present at or near the locations where all 6 hikers had disappeared. They found blog posts where he'd written about his natural accountability philosophy. They obtained warrants for his home and business in a storage unit registered to his survival school. Investigators found a locked cabinet containing items from the victims: Jerry Parrish's watch, a compass belonging to another victim, a carabiner, a water bottle. Wayne had kept trophies from each kill. They also found journals describing his crimes in detail. Wayne had documented each murder, including maps showing where he'd hidden the bodies. He'd written extensively about his philosophy, explaining how he believed he was serving a higher purpose by removing people who didn't respect the wilderness. Wayne Hollister was arrested in August 2011. He confessed to all 6 murders, showing no remorse. He explained his ideology calmly, describing how he believed he was enforcing natural law, ensuring that only those who truly understood the wilderness survived. Using Wayne's maps, recovery teams found Jerry Parrish's remains in September 2011. They found 4 other victims over the following year. One body has never been recovered. Despite extensive searches, Wayne's trial revealed disturbing connections to others who shared his philosophy. He'd been corresponding with a hunting guide in Montana and a park ranger in Wyoming. Both were investigated. The hunting guide was convicted of manslaughter in an unrelated case. The park ranger remains under investigation. A task force called Operation Mountain Watch was formed to investigate the broader network. They've identified at least 12 suspicious disappearances across multiple states that bear similarities to Wayne's crimes. The investigation continues, coordinating with agencies throughout the Western United States and Canada. Wayne Hollister was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. He sits in prison, still maintaining that he was serving a necessary function, that the wilderness needed protection from those who didn't understand its demands. Jerry, Parrish's family finally received closure, but the knowledge of how he died brought no peace. His mother established a foundation promoting wilderness safety education, hoping to honor her son's memory by helping others survive the mountains he loved. The Chugach Range remains popular with hikers and climbers, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. But now there's an added awareness that the greatest danger might not be the terrain itself, but the people who watch from the shadows, waiting for opportunities to act on their twisted beliefs about who deserves to survive in the wilderness. Story 7. Jason Jolkowski was 19 years old when he flew to Fairbanks, Alaska, in the summer of 2001. He was a college student from Omaha, Nebraska, taking a break from his studies to work a seasonal job at a fishing lodge near the Tanana River. Jason was responsible, hard-working, the kind of young man parents never worried about. He'd lined up the job through a program that placed college students in Alaskan hospitality positions for the summer season. It seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. He arrived in Fairbanks on May 28th and was scheduled to take a bush plane to the remote lodge on June 1st. But Jason never made it to the lodge. He vanished somewhere between the airport and his departure point, disappearing into a city he'd never visited before, in a state where he knew no one. The circumstances of his disappearance were baffling. Jason had checked into a budget motel near the airport on May 20th. He'd called his parents that evening, excited about the upcoming flight to the lodge. The next morning, he'd eaten breakfast at the motel's cafe, chatted with the waitress about his plans, and returned to his room. At 11 a.m., he'd walked out of the motel carrying his backpack, heading toward a meeting point 3 blocks away, where he was supposed to catch a ride to the floatplane base. He never arrived at the meeting point. The person who was supposed to pick him up waited for 45 minutes before calling the lodge to report that Jason hadn't shown up. The lodge manager called the motel. The staff confirmed Jason had left. A missing persons report was filed that afternoon. Fairbanks police canvassed the 3-block route between the motel and the meeting point. They found no witnesses who remembered seeing Jason. No security cameras had captured him. It was as if he'd simply evaporated while walking down a city street in broad daylight. Search teams walked every alley, checked every dumpster, questioned every business owner. Nothing. Jason's parents flew to Alaska within 24 hours. They distributed flyers, gave interviews to local media, pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The police investigation continued for weeks, then months, but produced no solid leads. Jason Jolkowski had become a ghost, present one moment and gone the next. What investigators didn't know was that Jason had been specifically targeted by someone who'd been watching the motel for weeks. Reverend Philip Talmadge ran a halfway house called New Beginnings on the outskirts of Fairbanks. The facility supposedly helped troubled young men transition back into society after incarceration or addiction treatment. Reverend Talmadge was well respected in Fairbanks, known for his charitable work and his dedication to helping those society had forgotten. He sat on several non-profit boards. He had connections to the mayor's office through his sister-in-law, who worked as a city administrator, but New Beginnings was not what it appeared to be. Reverend Talmadge had been using the facility to traffic vulnerable young men, forcing them into labor at remote work camps disguised as wilderness rehabilitation programs. Over the years, he'd perfected a system for identifying targets. young men traveling alone, new to Alaska, without strong local connections who would notice immediately if they disappeared. Reverend Talmadge had been monitoring the budget motels near the airport, looking for exactly the kind of person Jason represented. When he'd seen Jason check in alone, carrying all his belongings in a single backpack, he'd recognized an opportunity. He'd followed Jason when he left the motel on May 29th. The Reverend pulled alongside Jason in his white van, which bore the New Beginnings logo and religious symbols. He rolled down his window and asked if Jason needed a ride. Jason politely declined, saying he was just walking a few blocks. Reverend Talmadge persisted, explaining that he ran a Christian ministry and was heading in the same direction. Something about the religious imagery and the Reverend's clerical collar made Jason reconsider. He accepted the ride. Once Jason was in the van, Reverend Talmadge locked the doors and kept driving past the meeting point. When Jason protested, the Reverend pulled a pistol from beneath his seat and ordered him to remain quiet. Jason, terrified and confused, complied. They drove for 2 hours, heading northeast on back roads, until they reached a remote compound deep in the forest. The compound was surrounded by high fencing topped with barbed wire. Inside were several crude barracks buildings and a work area. A dozen young men, all between 18 and 25, were engaged in various labor tasks, cutting firewood, processing animal hides, maintaining equipment. All of them looked exhausted, malnourished, broken. This was Reverend Talmadge's true operation. He called it a spiritual reformation camp, but it was actually a forced labor operation. The young men were held against their will, working 16-hour days, fed minimal rations, subjected to religious indoctrination mixed with physical punishment. Those who tried to escape were caught by guards and severely beaten. Those who complied were promised eventual release, though that promise was never fulfilled. Jason was processed into the camp system. His identification was confiscated. His head was shaved. He was given work clothes and assigned to a barracks. For the next 3 months, he worked alongside the others, cutting timber that was sold to lumber companies, preparing animal pelts that were marketed to fur traders, performing maintenance on equipment. The work was brutal. The conditions were worse. Reverend Talmadge visited the camp weekly, delivering sermons about redemption through labor, about how suffering purified the soul. He never acknowledged that he was holding people prisoner, never admitted that his operation was slavery disguised as ministry. In his twisted theology, he genuinely believed he was saving these young men from lives of sin and purposelessness. Jason tried to escape twice. The first time, he was caught within hours by guards who patrolled the perimeter with dogs. He was beaten and placed in isolation for a week. The second time, he made it almost 5 miles into the forest before being recaptured. The punishment was more severe. 3 weeks in isolation with reduced food rations. In September 2001, a logging crew working in a different section of the forest stumbled upon something disturbing: graves. Shallow graves, partially exposed by recent heavy rains. The crew immediately contacted authorities. Alaska state troopers and FBI agents descended on the area. They found 5 bodies, all young men, all showing signs of malnutrition and physical abuse. Identification was difficult due to decomposition, but investigators worked methodically, using dental records and DNA analysis. The bodies represented victims from different years, suggesting the operation had been running for some time. The investigation expanded rapidly. Financial records were subpoenaed. Real estate holdings were examined. a pattern emerged showing that Reverend Talmadge owned several properties in remote areas of Alaska, all registered under different non-profit organizations. Surveillance was established on these locations. In October 2001, a tactical team raided the compound where Jason was being held. They found 14 young men in various states of physical and psychological distress. Jason was among them, 40 pounds lighter than when he'd arrived, but alive. The raid also uncovered extensive documentation, records of labor output, financial ledgers showing profits from the forced labor operation, correspondence with buyers of the timber and furs. Reverend Philip Talmadge was arrested along with 6 associates who'd helped run the operation. Jason and the other survivors were hospitalized, then gradually reunited with their families. The investigation revealed that over 9 years, at least 30 young men had been forced into Reverend Talmadge's labor camps. 5 had died from overwork, malnutrition, or punishment. The others had eventually been released when they became too sick or injured to work effectively, dumped at homeless shelters with threats against speaking about their experiences. The trial began in 2002 and lasted 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming: survivor testimony, financial records, physical evidence from the camps. Reverend Talmadge showed no remorse, insisting he'd been providing spiritual guidance and rehabilitation. The jury convicted him on multiple counts, including kidnapping, human trafficking, and murder. He received a sentence of life without parole, but the investigation didn't end there. Reverend Talmadge's records revealed a network of similar operations across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Names of associates, addresses of other camps, financial connections to legitimate businesses that had knowingly purchased goods produced by forced labor. A federal task force was assembled to investigate the full scope of the network. Over the next 5 years, 17 additional arrests were made. Several other labor camps were discovered and shut down. More than 40 victims were identified and rescued. But investigators believe there are still undiscovered locations, still operators who evaded detection, still victims who were never reported missing because they came from circumstances where no one was looking for them. Jason Jolkowski returned to Nebraska, spent years in therapy recovering from the trauma, and eventually became an advocate for human trafficking victims. He works with organizations that combat forced labor and speaks publicly about his experience. His parents established a foundation that helps families search for missing persons in Alaska. The case remains partially open. The task force, now called Operation New Beginnings in bitter irony, continues investigating leads about the broader network. Anonymous tips arrive periodically, describing suspicious camps or religious organizations that might be fronts for trafficking operations. Each lead is pursued, though the vastness of Alaska's wilderness makes investigation challenging. Reverend Talmadge sits in maximum security prison, still maintaining that his work was divinely inspired. He corresponds with others who share elements of his theology, letters that are monitored by authorities for any indication of ongoing operations. Some of his associates have been released after serving their sentences, and their movements are tracked by law enforcement, though they can't be prevented from relocating to remote areas. The story of Jason Jolkowski and the young men trapped in forced labor camps is a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the wilderness itself. Sometimes it operates under the cover of religious authority, charitable work, and community respectability. Sometimes it builds fences and calls them salvation. Sometimes it uses faith as a weapon and scripture as chains. And sometimes the Alaska bush isn't empty at all. Sometimes it conceals operations that shouldn't exist in a civilized society, hidden by distance and deception, protected by people who believe their authority places them above the law, sustained by a network that continues to operate in shadows that investigators are still trying to illuminate. The investigation continues. The searches go on, and families wait, wondering if someone they love might still be out there, held in a place they'll never find without help, hoping that someone will care enough to keep looking until every hidden camp is found and every prisoner is freed. Thank you for watching Lost in Fear. If this video helped you relax or fall asleep, please consider liking and subscribing. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. These stories remind us that the wilderness holds many secrets, and sometimes the most dangerous predators walk on two legs. Stay safe out there, and remember, not everyone offering help has good intentions. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful.